Hello, everyone. It's great to have you here with us today. My name is Megan Donaldson, and I'm part of the Alumni Relations team here at Trinity Development and Alumni. I'm delighted that you're joining us for the latest episode in our Inspiring Ideas at Trinity series. Today, we'll be exploring Shakespeare's First Folio with Professor Andy Murphy, followed by a discussion on Shakespeare in Ireland with Lynn Parker of Rough Magic and Dr. Stephen O'Neill of Maynooth University. Now, before introducing our speakers, there's just a few things I'd like to note. This webinar will last for just under an hour. There will be a presentation followed by a panel discussion, after which we'll open the floor to your questions. To submit your question, simply use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we do encourage as much interaction as possible. So please do, you're welcome to pop in your questions throughout the discussion, throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them towards the end. I'd also like to note that we are using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles for this webinar. If you'd like to turn these subtitles on or off, click the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, then click Show or Hide Subtitles. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our YouTube alumni channel. Now to introduce our speakers. Lynn Parker is the Artistic Director and co-founder of Rough Magic. Most recently, she directed The Tempest for Rough Magic, produced in partnership with the Kilkenny Arts Festival. In 2020, she directed the world premiere production of Mike McCormick's Solar Bones, adapted by Michael West and featuring Stanley Townsend, which transferred to the Abbey in 2022. It was nominated as Best Production, winning the 2020 Irish Times Award for Best Actor and Best Director. Lynn was an associate artist of Charabanc Theatre Company and was awarded the Irish Times Special Tribute Award in 2008 and an honorary doctorate from Trinity College Dublin in 2010. Dr. Stephen O'Neill is Associate Professor in English at Maynooth University, with research interests in Shakespeare and also adaptation. He has published widely on adapted Shakespeare, especially in digital cultures, including Shakespeare and YouTube, and Staging Ireland, representations in Shakespeare and Renaissance drama. He recently co-edited Shakespeare and Refugees and the Arden Research Handbook to Shakespeare and Adaptation. His funded project, Literature and Ireland's Trees, is part of his current research on the literary life of trees. And finally, our presenter and MC for today is Andy Murphy, the 1867 Professor of English here at Trinity College Dublin. He studied English and psychology at Trinity as an undergraduate and continued with his MA and PhD at Brandeis University in Boston. He worked for much of his career at the University of St. Andrews in the UK before joining the School of English in Trinity in 2018. He's the author and editor of several books, including Shakespeare in Print, A History and Chronology of Shakespeare Publishing, and Ireland, Reading and Cultural Nationalism, 1790 to 1930. His edited collection, The Nation and British Literature and Culture, will be published by Cambridge later this year. So congratulations in advance on that, Andy. I'll hand you over to Andy now, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Megan, for your kind introduction. It's very nice to be here as a Trinity alum myself. And can I thank everybody for joining us today as well for our Inspiring Ideas at Trinity session on Shakespeare and the book. I'm going to ask you to bear with me for 2 seconds because I've got some images to show during the first part of this. So if you bear with me, I'm going to switch to share screen and bring them up for you. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that they're okay. So our webinar today is part of a package of different events that we've been running at Trinity in recent times, all of them connected in one way or another with the fact that this year marks the 400th anniversary of the first publication of the first collected edition of Shakespeare's work in 1623, so the book that we know nowadays as the First Folio, as Shakespeare's First Folio. So we have a number of events that have been going on in relation to this. There's an exhibition in the long room of the old library. There's an online exhibition, and we had a one-day symposium as well. So coming on to think a little bit about the First Folio, I guess one question we can ask ourselves is, why is it so important? There are a number of answers to that question, but one particular answer that we might focus on is the fact that when Shakespeare died in 1616, only half of his plays had been brought to print at that point. So had it not been for the fact that the First Folio appeared 7 years later, it's possible that we could have lost the other half of his plays. So just to bring that into focus a little bit more for us, if I bring up the contents page of the First Folio, there you can see it there. You can see the list of plays organized by comedies, histories, and tragedies. And if I now highlight the plays that appeared in that volume for the first time, you can see the extent of the number of plays that appeared there in the folio that we might have lost without it. And just thinking about that collection of plays, it includes The Tempest, it includes A Winter's Tale, it includes Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra. So a lot of plays that we might consider to be, I suppose, heavy hitters from the Shakespeare canon could potentially have been lost to us without that volume's appearing in print in 1623. Now, we have evidence that a number of copies of the book crossed the Irish Sea from England here to Ireland. So we've got bits and pieces of evidence suggesting that copies were owned by different people over the centuries here in Ireland. But in fact, only one copy of the volume still exists here on the island of Ireland, and that is the copy that we hold here at Trinity. So this is the spine of our actual volume. You can see the nice binding there, and you can see the gold embossed lettering on it. So this is one of the jewels in the crown of the Trinity collection. As a Shakespearean myself, I like to think it's up there with the Book of Kells, but I suspect my medieval colleagues might not necessarily agree with my saying that. So how did we get the volume? Where did it come from? Well, we purchased it in 1805, and we purchased it, excuse me, from the library of this man. So this is Arthur Brown. You can see from his dates there that he died in 1805. His library was put up for auction, and Trinity sent somebody along to that auction. And one of the things that they picked up was this copy of the First Folio. We paid £26, 11 shillings and sixpence for the book. Don't know how many people out there are old enough to remember pre-decimal currency in pounds, shillings and pence, but that's what we paid, 26, 11 and sixpence. That was a substantial amount of money at the time, but it was actually a very good price for the folio. So folio prices were already starting to go up and go up and go up, and they become stratospheric by the end of the 19th century. So 26, 11 and 6 was a pretty good price at the time. I often wonder whether it might have been the best investment that Trinity ever made. And I say that because just a couple of years ago, a copy of the First Folio sold at auction for just shy of $10 million. And that's the copy you're seeing in front of you there with the proud new owner, a man called Stefan Lowenthal, who bought it, who paid just under $10 million for that copy of the book. Now, copies that sell for that kind of price, so copies that sell in the millions, they tend to be pristine copies. They tend to be perfect in just about every way. And you can get a sense of that just by looking at the image there. You can see that the pages are perfect, they're clean. This is, one of the best copies of the book that's come to market in recent times. Our copy is not in that kind of pristine, sterile condition. So if I show you the opening and the title page of our copy, you'll see that it's in rather a different state from that $10 million copy there. So if you look on the right hand there, you see the famous Druce Hut engraving of Shakespeare, that iconic image of him. But you can also see that the title page is a kind of work of recovery or a work of salvage, right? So it obviously was in a bad condition. Somebody has retrieved as much of it as they can, and they have pasted onto a sheet, and the sheet has been bound into the copy. So throughout the book, we get evidence of wear and tear and usage and so on. In general terms, it's actually in good condition. It's complete. There's nothing missing from it. The text is complete. But we see instances of wear and tear and repair work on the volume. So I'm just going to show you a set of images where we can see some of this as we go along. So here, if you look at this image, you can see the outlines of a scorch mark in the page. So it seems pretty clear that what's happened here is somebody was reading the book by candlelight, I think, probably. And what's happened is the candle has tipped over and it's gone into the center of the book, into the gutter of the book, and it's set fire to the center of the book in that way. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more on that to give a clearer sense of what's happening. So here we have the same image, but enlarged a little bit. You can see the edges of the burn mark there. But the really interesting thing about this, I think, is you can see the repair work that's been done as well. So a piece of paper has been pasted into the gap made by the candle burn. But the interesting thing you can see is that somebody has taken a pen and they have very, very carefully tried to replicate the missing print that's been lost in the burn, right? So instead of just writing in the missing words, they've tried really, really hard to replicate what the print was, what the missing print was. This is, very highly skilled and very interesting work. And if I had the book here to show you, I could go down through the burn pages and you could see this happening page by page. The book has also been subject to a couple of domestic accidents, shall we say. So here is a page of Henry V. This is the so-called wooing scene in Henry V. And I'm sure you can probably see there that we have an animal print of some sort. So an animal of some sort has walked across the pages of the book here. There's division as to whether this is a cat or a dog. I'm a cat lover myself, so I like to think it's a large cat, but possibly it was a small dog. So walking across the pages while the book is being read. And here we have what seem to be drink stains. We have this on a number of pages in the book. So somebody who's engrossed in reading it, and they're drinking a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or a glass of beer, whatever it is, and they've, perhaps the cat has jostled their elbow as they're doing that, and they've ended up spilling some of the drink onto the page. So we get evidence of that. So these are kind of accidental things that have happened to the book. But we also have deliberate interventions in it as well. I'm just going to show you a couple of these. So here is a passage in The Merry Wives of Windsor that some reader somewhere along the way has taken exception to for some reason, and so has written or has scored several lines through it to object to it. Very hard to see. It's a fairly anodyne passage in the play. It's very hard to see what's being objected to here. And then here we have an attempt by a reader to alter the text of the play. There isn't much of this in the volume, but here's an example of it. You can see the text is being crossed out and text is being changed or being added. And one of the things that's being taken out of the text here is the word changeling. And again, it's a little hard to know why this particular reader has decided to get rid of that particular word, but they've objected to it in some way. So oftentimes when we're looking at what we're seeing in the book, it can be a little bit hard to know what is going on, right? So why is that passage crossed out? Why is this passage being changed? But we've also come across something in the book that is even harder to find a motivation or an explanation for than these particular things I've just been showing you. And this is something that we find opposite the opening page to the text of King John. So you can see that the book has a blank page here on the left-hand side, and somebody has decided to use it to jot down some inscriptions. And again, I'm going to zoom in on that for you so that you can see it a little more clearly. So in preparation for putting the book on display, I went through the book page by page, and I discovered this set of inscriptions, which nobody had ever really remarked on before. And we have collectively been scratching our heads about what they are and what they mean ever since. So we got a little bit of media coverage of the exhibition a couple of weeks back. And I've had lots of emails since then with suggestions as to what we might be looking at. So somebody suggested that it might be Hebrew. It's not Hebrew. Somebody suggested it might be Farsi or Persian, and we looked into that. That seemed like a good suggestion for a while, but it's not Farsi. Somebody else who had a connection with the Freemasons wrote to me and said he wondered whether it might be Masonic code. Again, we looked at that. It's not Masonic code. A couple of people suggested Coptic script of some sort. And again, that turned out to be sort of a blind alleyway, so to speak. And we had one person who said what we needed to do was to put a mirror beside the text and read the text in the mirror so that we were reading it backwards. Really interesting and a great suggestion, but it didn't really lead to anything for us. As best we can figure out at the moment, this appears to be a kind of early form of shorthand, and probably a form of shorthand devised by a guy called James Weston. So there's a computer analyst here at Trinity who's been helping us with this, and he feels pretty sure that that's what we've got here. But deciphering it is another matter entirely. So I don't know if anybody who's tuned in today knows modern shorthand, but really, in order to understand a piece of shorthand writing, you need to have fully internalized the rules of it. And the rules of Western shorthand are very complicated. So we're still trying to figure out whether we can make sense of it and decipher it. So at the heart of our copy of the First Folio, then, is a kind of mystery, I suppose, in a way. What is this exactly that we're looking at here? And more to the point, what does it mean? So we feel that that mystery surrounding these symbols makes our copy of the folio special for us. But I would say, in fact, that all of the things that I've just been telling you about make this a special and interesting copy of the book. And I say that because what we are seeing here is a book that is a living object. So it is something that bears the traces of its own life within itself. So we can see the life that it lived. And we can kind of almost eavesdrop, in a sense, on its readers as we turn the pages, right? So we remember back to them and their reading experience with the book. So if we just flip back to that $10 million copy that I showed you at the beginning, and you look at the cleanness of that copy, I would actually argue that our copy is more valuable as an object, as a living object, because of the fact that it bears these traces of its previous life and its previous readers. So that's why we feel it's one of the jewels in the crown of our collection here at Trinity. Now, I'm sorry, I'm just going to come off the share screen there again, if you just bear with me for a second. So when we were planning our series of events around the folio anniversary, We wanted, of course, to focus on the book, but we also want to broaden our attention beyond just, only talking about this object and only putting this object on display. So we wanted to think about Shakespeare and Ireland in broader terms. So what are the connections? What are the broader connections between Shakespeare and Ireland? So for the next bit of our webinar today, I'm going to move away from our just thinking about that book that we've been looking at and open things out. And I wonder, Stephen, if I could start with you in relation to this and ask if you might be able to say a little bit about, I suppose, about two things. Perhaps we might talk about two things. So can we talk about Ireland in Shakespeare, and can we talk about Shakespeare in Ireland? So if I could just hand over to you to perhaps say a little bit about that.
Thanks, Andy. And I love the detail of the paw print in Henry V. And of course, it's in that play where Shakespeare has we might call his most Irish moment with Captain Macmorris in the Four Captains scene, who famously says, "What is my nation of my nation? Who talks of my nation?" And he's part of a kind of tradition then of the stage Irishman in the period more generally. That's probably the most kind of, I'd say, the most Irish moment in the plays. We also have the allusion to Essex, the Earl of Essex, and his disastrous campaign in Ireland against Hugh O'Neill in 1599. So that gets mentioned in the chorus of Henry V. And it's in the history plays more generally that Ireland tends to make its kind of cameo. It appears quite sporadically. And that is largely because Shakespeare's drawing on Holinshed and other materials, which he would have thought of as his original materials, his sources for these history plays. So we get references to Ireland in Richard II, which is a play that is written in the mid-1590s, but as people probably know, is set in the medieval period in the 14th century. And the king in that play talks about going to Ireland, talks about the urgency of events in Ireland. He says, now for our Irish wars. He says, we must supplant these rough, rug-headed kerns which live like venom, where no venom else, but only they have privilege to live. So, this is an extraordinary moment in a play. He goes to Ireland and that becomes a disastrous expedition for him, because it's during his absence in Ireland that Bolingbroke seizes power and ends up usurping Richard II. So that Richard's disappearance in Ireland is seen as precipitating his kind of tragic fall. And we might think of those moments in the play as instances where Shakespeare is marked by the Elizabethan moment that he's writing in. So he's immersed in an early modern world that is shaping his imagination. And Ireland is part of that early modern world. And that world, as we know, includes colonization and plantation. So what I'm not suggesting that Shakespeare is necessarily complicit in the Elizabethan colonization of Ireland. The history plays in particular do seem to be marked by the kind of zeitgeist, the sense that Ireland is a recurring problem in the 1590s, the last decade of Elizabeth's reign, where she's, and Ireland is a huge draw financially on the Elizabethan kingdom. So Shakespeare's kind of marked by that as well, as are other dramatists in the period. And we might, because of the way Ireland is figured in the period more generally, we might tend to look beyond the literal references like Macmorris or Richard II that I've mentioned, and think to more surprising moments where Ireland might occur in the canon. So there is an argument that The Tempest, which, as people will know, is set on an imaginary island. It could be in the Mediterranean, it could be in the Caribbean, but perhaps what he has in his mind, what's shaping his imagination in writing that play, is the neighboring island, and that Caliban reads as a kind of version of the stage Irishman who's marked by colonization, who is in this kind of struggle with Prospero, his master, who talks about, who curses, who uses language, the master's tongue, to curse the master. And it's been seen as a play that in some ways is proleptic of or anticipates a post-colonial sensibility, because Caliban is kind of given these moments where he can access a knowledge prior to the settlement of the island. And there is a critical discourse around Caliban, which suggests that he can be read as representation of the native Irish in the period more generally. So that's some of the ways in which Ireland appears in the Shakespeare canon. And then if we turn to how Shakespeare appears in an Irish context, I think he's always, for a long period, he's marked by Anglo-Irish relations. So to think on Caliban a little further, there's a notorious cartoon, a Punch cartoon, which uses Caliban to depict if I recall correctly, the late 19th century rebellious Irish. So there's a kind of continuity established, an appropriation of Shakespeare, an appropriation of Caliban in English discourse about Ireland, negative discourse about Ireland. So there's a long tradition of Shakespeare performance in Ireland, of Shakespeare editions in Ireland, which of course you have worked on. And in a way, Shakespeare has been appropriated, as we know about Shakespeare's kind of global story more generally. Shakespeare's been appropriated across all sides. You know, the Shakespeare's available to everyone. So just as Shakespeare was embraced by the Anglo-Irish ascendancy class, he was equally embraced by Irish nationalists. And we know that people like Pádraic Pearse and Thomas MacDonagh, 1916 insurrectionists, had copies of Shakespeare's plays, knew the plays, quoted from them fondly. And I think that's why then Shakespeare appears, has another cameo. So we get Irish cameos in Shakespeare, but we get Shakespearean cameos in Irish literary classics like Ulysses. So in the National Library episode, Stephen Dedalus outlines his theory of Hamlet, which I won't go into, but he outlines his theory of Hamlet. And what we get in that episode as they debate is a kind of compression of Shakespeare's history and reception in Ireland. So there's the famous joke that Buck Mulligan makes about, oh, Shakespeare, I seem to know the name, the chap that writes like Sing. And there's other jokes about, oh, has no one made him out to be an Irishman yet, which I think is where your title comes from. There's references to Plunkett Barton, Judge Barton, who had written this book in, I think it was published around 1916, which is called Links Between Ireland and Shakespeare, and which traces all those allusions, some of which I've mentioned, but also does some speculation. You know, so what happened, what would it be if Shakespeare had written a scene in which Richard is in Ireland? And then Barton goes on to imagine what that scene would have looked like. So he's doing a kind of what we would now recognize as a form of Shakespeare adaptation. So Joyce has been very playful, I think, about how Shakespeare's been used. Shakespeare's a chameleon-like figure in that National Library episode of Ulysses. And I think Joyce is very astute at recognizing that Shakespeare's Britishness and Shakespeare's use by empire, but also how Shakespeare can be kind of turned to other causes as well.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That's a really comprehensive overview of things, I think. And in terms of Irish writing, I'm also thinking of Frank McGuinness's play Mutabilities, you know, which actually imagines Shakespeare traveling to Ireland, you know, to meet up with Edmund Spenser down in Cork, and almost suggesting that, like Spenser, Shakespeare might have wanted to be a colonist in an odd sort of way, you know. But certainly loads of really interesting things there. And I think in a way, part of what you're pointing to is a narrow range of Irish reference in Shakespeare, in the sense that we can say, oh, well, he's got an Irish character, he's got this, he's got that. But also that Shakespeare was grappling with the big issues of his day, which kind of embraced and partly came from Ireland in various ways. You know, so you mentioned The Tempest there, Stephen, and of course that was written immediately in the wake of the plantation of Ulster, you know, so we're getting all of that stuff fed through.
So Ireland kind of comes back in, it comes in thematically and conceptually, I think, as well as through kind of literal or direct references.
Thanks, Stephen. I wonder if I could bring you in at this point, Lynn. You know, you're somebody who's directed Shakespeare You directed Shakespeare here in Players, of course, I think, and for Rough Magic a number of times, and you've worked in Belfast and you've worked in the UK as well. I wonder if I could ask you what you feel it means to put Shakespeare on in Ireland, and is that something different from putting Shakespeare on elsewhere, do you feel?
Well, we share the language, of course, but and as do Americans and Australians and Canadians, what have you. But there is that proximity. So you just, with each production, you have to find a context for it. And I was interested, Stephen just mentioned Sing there. And when I was watching Playboy of the Western World some years ago, it just struck me how Shakespearean it was. The bejeweled language, you know, and the well, mainly ironic language. But that's when I got the idea for Taming of the Shrew, which is a play I wanted to do because it is a kind of challenge to a feminist. So
to say the least.
Using it, to say the least. So you don't think there's a hill I have to climb. But when I looked at the play, it just started to resonate with what seemed to me a very Irish situation. A couple of strangers come into a small town and there's this guy, Baptista, and in my head, he runs the hotel and the garage and the spa. He's got everything, you know, and he's the two daughters. And one of them, in my head, they're from different marriages and all that stuff. So you start to see a sort of hinterland to this play. And to me, the sound of this play in particular sat very well with a West of Ireland or Midlands to West delivery, not anywhere particularly specific. Now, we didn't change the names, but the actors spoke in very strong Irish dialect. And when you look at it, it's a sort of satire on men. Apart from, it certainly isn't a feminist treatise or any kind of a love story in my perception. It's much more of a satire on a small community where women have to fight with enormous skullduggery, really, to survive and live. And so we set it in this little town. Hortensio was like the guy who ran the hotel, and the old fellas would all come in, and you know, and Petruchio and Grumio were kind of interlopers who were real cowboys, and we gave them a pretty cowboy look. So it really worked for that play, which is full of absolute, if I can use this word in a webinar, bejeweled bullshit. You know, where the lads are talking up the amount they can pay and this, that, and the other. But you also need a context where it's believable that marriage is a part of a barter system, and dowries and all of that are de rigueur. And so you want it far enough back that sort of stuff is credible, but you want it close enough that it feels part of our world. And that's kind of broadly what I was trying to do, and why I would choose normally to set Shakespeare in a period which has some connection to the modern world. So going back to sort of early 20th century, maybe late 19th century. But in fact, we went for the 1970s because the style just suited that cowboy mentality so well, and gave Monica Frawley, the designer, a fantastic palace. So she actually painted a mural on the back of the bar that was of Verona. So just for anybody who was interested, but it felt like Midlands Ireland. So it was a play that kind of used the kind of setup where I had seen in the old Clarence Hotel before it was done up, of country weddings, you know. So you get a whole sort of spectrum of society all out for the day, all in their finest, and you know, you can watch all the relationships that were kind of beetling away, and that was the setup for that production. When I did the Comedy of Errors in the RSC. And I had to sort of say, how do I get into this? And the clue is in the title. It's a comedy of errors. So I used a lot of references to commedia, really from Italian comedy, which it kind of is, right up to modern Hollywood via vaudeville and black and white movies, including Buster Keaton and Laurel and Hardy. So we use these kind of images and tropes, and even up to, and of course, you know, it's set in a port in the Mediterranean, which then and now is a sort of melting pot of different nationalities. So I really kind of put it up to the RSC. There was a war over this, and got the actors to play it in all sorts of different accents, Russian, Italian, whatever, North African. They were a little taken aback at the idea of not doing Shakespeare in RP, which of course we all know is a modern construct anyway, and it didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. And I've always found it very attractive to listen to Shakespeare spoken by actors who are not English. I love the sound of a wonderful Merchant of Venice was played in Ireland, in Cork, by a Polish actor playing Shylock, and he may not have been Jewish, but the otherness of the accent was absolutely perfect for the production. So I think you can really play with this, because the great thing about Shakespeare is that I think you can't hurt him. He will survive your experiments. And if you do it in good faith, I think you just add to the richness and give some sense of the texture of his original productions.
And would you, I mean, in your Irish productions, Lynn, would you always want your actors to be speaking in their own natural accents?
Pretty much, because I think you get a better result. But with the shrew, I actually asked them to deepen the accents. It wasn't their own accents, a lot of them were just from Dublin and whatever. But they had a familiarity with a West of Ireland accent. And actually, it was a theatrical accent. We really used sing as a kind of marker. So the sing fed into the delivery. And so the poetry of sing fed the poetry of Shakespeare. And it wasn't just funny, it was really quite beautiful at times.
Yeah, and you know, it is a thing that's often said that Hiberno English, or perhaps Northern, you know, the English of the north of Ireland, is probably closer to Elizabethan English than anything that's actually spoken in England right now. You know, so it's very interesting to think about that, and very interesting, I think, for that lineation that you've created through Sing, which of course Stephen was also talking about there in relation to Joyce. And I think you've done A Tempest as well, Lynn, haven't you? Is there?
Yes.
You felt from doing that kind of stands out in terms of an Irish context on that?
Well, the most recent one had a very Irish context indeed, because it was outdoors. So it had Irish weather to contend with. So we decided that we were going to set it not in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, which I'd done previously. I'd actually set it on a sort of Caribbean island. But this time we were going to set it on an island just off, somewhere between Ireland and Iceland, somewhere that looked a bit like Skellig Michael. But the joke was on us, really, because we got all the costumes to be weatherproof, and we were just expecting it to be hail and storm, which it had been the previous year. And the 2 weeks we ran in Kilkenny, well, the hottest in Ireland for some years, so we actually got Caribbean weather in an Irish setting, most unusual. But it was absolutely beautiful in the grounds of Kilkenny Castle, with wonderful sunsets and skyscapes. But the actors were absolutely boiling. So there you go. But yeah, they got on with it.
I really particularly like what you were saying there to begin with, Lynn, about the idea of the hinterland of the text, you know, and trying to, and it was very interesting to hear you talk about your own understanding of a kind of backstory to the Taming of the Shrew, you know, so what might come before the play starts and that sort of thing. And so it feels to me that in part what you're doing sometimes in in directing Shakespeare in Ireland is you're trying to find a kind of Irish hinterland. Would that be true?
Yeah, well, when I did Macbeth at the Lyric, I was very interested in the witches, being the kind of women who were just the sort of women who existed in little towns in the north and Antrim and those kind of places, and who just knew everything and knew everybody, and just seemed to be always the same age as well. They had this ageless feel to them, and you kind of felt they were almost part of the landscape, and certainly part of the mentality of the time. And so that was my way into them. And we did use Northern Irish accents. And I wish we'd gone a bit further with it, actually.
Mm-hmm. So how would you have pushed it a bit more? You would have just asked them to...
I think, to be honest, I think the actors felt that they were, because Northern Irish is so close to Scottish, that they were in danger of tipping into a Scottish imitation, and kind of step back from that a little bit. You'd have to ask them. It was fine, it just didn't quite have the juice that the Taming of the Shrew did.
Yeah, I mean, there's that famous story about Orson Welles' film of Macbeth, that they used these outrageous Scottish accents. And when he took the film back to the studio, they said, we can't have this, and insisted that he scrub the soundtrack to it and have them redo all of the dialogue in neutral American accents. So you can now get the film in either version. You can get the Supreme Scottish, or you can get the American. I'm conscious that we want to allow a little bit of time before we close for questions. So if I can ask people just to bear with me for 2 seconds, I'm just going to get the questions up on the screen in front of me here. So thanks very much to everybody. So I see a question for Stephen about Shakespeare in schools. Stephen, the fact that we have to read Shakespeare, even in Irish schools, let alone UK schools. And this question about whether this is a good thing, and if so, what are the benefits?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think it kind of creates, to use a slightly crude term, it does mean a pipeline. There's now a continuity in terms of exposure to Shakespeare, because it becomes familiar to people, I think, through, and in some ways it might be a bit of a love-hate, it's something that has to be done. I think it's prescribed text for higher level Leaving Cert, and then optional for ordinary level English. But it is quite unusual. I think in an English context, Shakespeare is no longer required kind of reading. And the Leaving Cert syllabus does actually have a very strong diversity on it. So Shakespeare's there as a kind of classic, along with Ibsen or along with your Euripides, as well as contemporary drama. And I think it does create a continuity. It does mean that when people, for students at university, when they come to study Shakespeare, that there is a sense of this is something that they're returning to. It can be an obstacle too, because then students might tend to gravitate towards Shakespeare and work on Shakespeare rather than kind of take on another early modern writer. So certainly our colleagues who are Spenserians, or experts in Ben Jonson, are a little fed up with Shakespeare's kind of dominance, but in another way he is a kind of entry point into a complex period for students. And I think it also gives, in an Irish context then, because there's that long history, my parents would have studied Shakespeare at school. I remember when I was a teenager, seeing a copy of Coriolanus, in the house, because my brother was doing it for the Leaving Cert at the time. And there's that sense that when you come to, finally do Coriolanus properly in university, you're kind of thinking back to, I kind of know what this is, it's a bit of a familiarity. And I'm thinking, it makes me think of the Druid Shakespeare production. And Fintan O'Toole did a nice piece on that at the time, which was talking about, because it was over 2 nights as well, there was that sense that for Irish audiences, or for audiences that saw that over 2 nights, that it was like seeing, family members. You felt, because the names were kind of familiar, there's that sense that Shakespeare has a kind of, as Lynn said earlier on, I think the good word to use is a proximity. And the proximity can be comforting, and it also can be something that needs a little bit of kind of finessing as well, or you need to delve into it.
I mean, I think it's interesting, when you teach Shakespeare, as I guess we both do, to have students coming who have been exposed to it in school is a very helpful thing. So I suppose we might also ask, are we over privileging this one writer or not? Is that an appropriate thing? It's a complicated question, I think.
I think it is, yeah. And I guess it's how Shakespeare is taught then in schools, and the plays that get selected as well. So there's been a long tradition of having, in the early years of secondary school, it's you study a comedy, and then you move into a tragedy, so there's that kind of sense that one genre is more important than the other, one's more kind of mature than another. So I think Hamlet is on the Leaving Cert at the moment. King Lear is due for the new Leaving Cert syllabus for 2025, I think. And you could make the argument that, that's a challenging text in lots of ways, not only because it's complex in terms of the themes, but also because, of its language, because it's dealing with a very old man, it's dealing with, generational kind of issues. It's dealing with someone, who's thinking about their death. And for, if you're 18 at school, that might not be the kind of, might not necessarily excite you, but at the same breath, it might be something that, 10 years on, 20 years on, you're going to remember. And I always like the argument that Ayanna Thompson makes, the American Shakespearean scholar, who makes the argument about how we remember Shakespeare and how we can remember Shakespeare differently. And that becomes really important in terms of a critical movement that's very kind of current in the United States, which is anti-racist Shakespeare. And the RSC has been doing work in that as well. And that we're not kind of perpetuating a traditional Shakespeare. We're not being, we're not treating Shakespeare as an icon. I think the idea of experimentation that Lynn mentioned earlier on is a really nice one. And I use that line to students, say, we can't hurt Shakespeare. He's fine. We're not going to damage him. He's very dead. We can play with these texts, so long as we base it in argument, so long as we're being, working from the text outward. But I think there's an increasing sense that Shakespeare is capacious, and we're never talking about one author or one book indeed, but a kind of protean multiplicity that Shakespeare becomes global and is globalized as well. And I would hope that some of that thinking is kind of coming into the classroom and how Shakespeare is being taught in the 21st century in Ireland.
Thanks, Stephen. And a question for you, Lynn, a very simple question. Why do you think his plays keep getting put on?
They are my very favorite thing, which is big ensemble pieces. And they are massive fun to do. So you in the UK, I mean, you have a whole company dedicated to that work, but it's more interesting when you look at Ireland, you actually see a lot of small fringe companies tackling Shakespeare. And it's partly because when you've no money, it doesn't matter. You've got you can do anything. And it's actually harder to do it when you're in the big subsidized theatres, and it costs a lot. But somewhere in the midway, people are still attracted just by the breadth of the stories. The fact that they include so many elements, wonderful visuals, which you can create with a bare stage or not. Music, masses of music. So they're giving actors great platforms, and also because you've got these ensemble companies, they're a great teaching force for young actors. If they're working with a big company, they're learning from really experienced people. They're watching the Owen Rose of this world, how they construct a performance, and they may not have a huge amount to do, but they're going to be able to learn in the process. And I think they're great communities for theatre companies. I think that's why people adore them.
Mm. So, I mean, you, in a way, you're sort of saying that there are plays you can cut your teeth on in a way as an actor and that sort of thing.
I think you can take your whole life through them. You know, you can. I mean, Stephen was talking about Lear, and you know that sort of is kind of the pinnacle or Prospero of one of those parts. And actually, I had Eleanor Methven play Prospero as a female Prospero, just to give someone of her heft the chance to go at one of those really big parts. So you can work your way up from Oswald's to Lear, you know, and actually the problem is more that you can do that as a male actor, and we're having to find ways of allowing female actors to do likewise. But they are absolutely a life's work and a life's study. I think that what you were saying about tackling Lear as an A-level or leaving cert student, I think that's the time of life when you're most serious about the big existential problems, and actually you kind of love all of that world. So yeah, I think fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying there about cross-gender casting as well is, of course, another very interesting issue, isn't it? And the Druid Shakespeare did quite a lot of that. I'm working on Henry V myself at the moment on an edition of it, and I'm struck by the number of productions going way back to the beginning of the 20th century that have used women actors in the role of Henry V, and it really gives you a completely different understanding of that play. In fact, I saw a great production last year which had a female Exeter. If anybody knows Henry V, they'll know the importance of the role of Exeter, and it changed the temperature of the play completely when you put a woman into that role. But that's perhaps a topic for another day. We have a number of questions backed up, and I'm really sorry that we're just not going to get to them. A couple of interesting suggestions about the shorthand. Thanks very much to everybody who's put those in the chat. And somebody has asked, what would Shakespeare be like without the First Folio? I guess, again, to go back to my initial point that we would have lost half the plays. But we'd look at them in a different way as well, because if you think back to that contents page that I put up and think about the way that the plays were divided into comedies, histories, and tragedies, we wouldn't be framing them in that way without the First Folio. I'm conscious that we are coming to the end of our time. So can I say a huge thank you to Lynn and to Stephen for giving up the time to talk to us so interestingly today on this topic. And can I thank Megan for doing the introductions, and quietly behind the scene, unseen by anybody, we have Garima, who's doing all the technical stuff and who's made the whole thing happen. So thank you very much, Garima and Megan. And I will now hand back to Megan to wind things up for us. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm just going to add all my thanks to yours, to you first off, for just such a super presentation. It was really interesting. It was amazing to see all the little nitty gritty of the First Folio in ours. And I think we probably all would have thought, oh, the Christine one is definitely the better one. But by the end of your presentation, I was thinking, well, ours just hasn't had a life. It's so much more interesting. And you can imagine someone sitting there just with their feet up and their mug of beer or tea or whatever, just reading away, which really brought it to life, which was amazing. And thanks as well to Lynn and Stephen for your time, for your insights, for your thoughts. It was really, really interesting. It was so nice to come at it from two very, very different perspectives and get nearly sort of a 360 of the First Folio, as it were. I'd like to thank Garima as well for being a brilliant tech person down in the back. And certainly, last but certainly not least, all of you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you here with us. And it's great for so many of you to ask questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all. But it's great to have that engagement and enthusiasm there on display. I'm just going to share my screen now with details of our next upcoming webinar, which we hope you'll join us for next month. It's Inspiring Ideas is going to welcome Susan Ahern. She's an alumni awardee, and she'll be presenting on All or Nothing from Front Square to the Olympic Stadium. Some of our Olympic alumni Olympic athletes will discuss the secrets up to their success, the inspirations that drove them, and how being a student at Trinity has shaped their incredible journeys. Details on how to register for this next webinar will be sent via email and posted to social media in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments regarding this webinar series or any other questions you'd like to ask us here in the alumni office, you're very, very welcome to email us at alumni@tcd.ie. So I'll just say thank you again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again in May. Thanks very much.